So I want to officially welcome you. My name is Sarah Paterka. I am from Interfaith Action. I know most of you, and we're excited that you are with us tonight. This is a cold evening here in Minnesota, and we are excited to have you all in the comfort of your homes, hopefully with a warm beverage in your hand, ready to do some learning together. We welcome Shirley, Sherrod, Stephen Carpenter, Uhuru Williams, who you probably all recognize, and Randy Roth, our executive director. We welcome you tonight, and we are excited that you are here. We ask that, again, you use your mute, leave yourself on mute tonight, and utilize the chat box. If you have any questions, we're doing a little different. We are kind of having a little bit of a Q&A panel interview style, and we'll have it moderated by Dr. Uhuru Williams, who we're excited who will moderate for us tonight. But first, I'm going to introduce Randy Roth, our executive director, and she's going to introduce all of our wonderful panel of speakers. So Randy, take it away, and I will keep admitting folks.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's wild to see so many worlds colliding and everybody who's here tonight. I welcome all of you. For some of you, it's your first time at an Interfaith Action event. We mobilize the untapped labor source of faith community volunteers.
I'm not showing up.
People, can you hear me? Uhuru, can you hear me? Yes. People who are not just looking for a way to make a difference, they're praying for a way to make a difference and need to be connected with pathways for effective action. You have a real treat tonight. I'm going to introduce our speakers in the order in which you'll meet them. First, Dr. Uhuru Williams will serve as our seminar leader and moderator tonight. Dr. Williams is the Distinguished University Chair and Professor and the founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas. Uhuru is a nationally known author and commentator. He's the author or editor of 7 books, including Rethinking the Black Freedom Movement and The Black Panthers: Portraits of an Unfinished Revolution. Uhuru is our treasured partner for building equity and opportunity in St. Paul, and we're very proud that he's a member of the Interfaith Action Board
from all the different times I've signed on.
Next, it's my honor to introduce our 2 distinguished guest speakers, and I want to preface their introduction by saying this. Interfaith Action's vision is opportunity grows and poverty recedes when people of faith commit themselves to effective action. Both Stephen Carpenter and Shirley Sherrod have dedicated their entire lives to just this kind of effective action, and the worlds around them show it. Stephen will speak first. Stephen Carpenter is the Deputy Director and Senior Staff Attorney at Farmers Legal Action Group, Inc., or FLAG, a national nonprofit law firm that represents low-income family farmers in their efforts to stay on the land. Stephen served as Senior Counsel in the Office of the Monitor in Pigford, the African American Farmers National Class Action Race Discrimination case, and currently serves as the court-appointed ombudsman for the In Re Black Farmers Discrimination case. He's a nationally recognized and nationally acclaimed expert in legal issues that affect family farmers. He speaks nationally, both in local gatherings, in barns and community centers, and in national legal conferences. He's presented training sessions in more than 30 states, to equip farmers, advocates, attorneys, judges, and policymakers to enforce and advance farmers' rights. Stephen is a graduate of Drury College in Springfield, Missouri, and of Stanford Law School, where he was the executive editor of the Stanford Law Review. At FLAG, Stephen's work has centered on issues including discrimination in agricultural lending, debtor-creditor issues, and most recently, farmers' rights related to COVID. And finally, it's my privilege to introduce my friend and teacher and trusted colleague, Shirley Sherrod. Shirley Sherrod was born and raised in Baker County, Georgia. Her life's work has been devoted to making life better there and throughout the nation. Shirley worked for many years as the Georgia State Director of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, a nonprofit cooperative of Black farmers, landowners, and co-ops. Shirley is also the former Georgia State Director of Rural Development for the United States Department of Agriculture. Shirley currently serves as director of the Southwest Georgia Project, a 60-year-old service organization that covers 14 counties that began as part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. The Southwest Georgia Project's work focuses on voting rights, voter education, welfare rights, school integration, Black land loss, and community organizing. Throughout Shirley's life, she has worked as a civil rights activist, a farmers' rights activist, a mentor to young leaders, and a national leader in achieving justice for farmers and communities. Welcome.
Are you ready for me?
We are, Uhuru.
Great, thank you. I want to thank everybody for coming out this evening, in particular Stephen and Shirley. And just as a brief preface to our conversation tonight, we're living in a moment where we are not accustomed to talking about issues of Black farmers and how they are intimately connected to larger conversations about dismantling systemic racism and racial injustice in America. In fact, we sometimes forget that before the two waves of the Great Migration, 90% of African Americans lived in the rural South. And so many of the issues that we deal with today had their genesis in communities and really around issues of access to land and labor and disparities that were tied to that condition. We're fortunate to have both Stephen and Shirley be able to comment on this. It'll be fun in particular to talk to Shirley because in some ways, her challenges are a reflection of the historical moment we just went through as a nation and are reflective of the playbook that we saw play out over the last 4 years. So we are incredibly indebted to both of them for joining us today. And Shirley, I can't wait to talk to you. But I'm going to begin this evening with Stephen. Stephen, again, we are used to seeing Black farmers as being invisible in this conversation. So could you describe the general background of the struggle for Black farmers and especially the role of the U.S. Department of Agriculture in those issues?
It's really a pleasure to be with everyone. Thanks a lot, Uhuru. And sure, so I want to talk just a little bit about the background of some of the struggles that Black farmers had faced over the last century. And I think that from this background and from the things that Shirley will talk about, I think we see 2 or 3 main themes here which can connect these struggles to the things going on in Minnesota, St. Paul in particular. One is that Shirley's work embodies organized grassroots activism, self-help organizations, the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, the Southwest Georgia Project. And it's really interesting to hear Shirley talk about how that work with Black farmers is relevant to St. Paul and all of our work. A second thing that Shirley was intimately involved in is the first agricultural land trust ever in the United States. And so what that tells us, her New Communities Project that she worked on decades ago, is that when we want to think about autonomy and justice and food justice and community justice, we can think creatively about the land and how we own it. There's not just one way to do it. And farm issues raise that quite precisely. The third thing I think that we can gain from this as we work through these issues is not to be negative, but how far we have to go, how big a hole there is. And we can just say, oh, we're going to be good from now on. That won't do it. One of the things I hope we get from this is the necessity to take really aggressive action, to acknowledge the harms that have taken place and figure out how to fix them. So with that said, let's just set the scene a little bit. We coming out of the Civil War, we have emancipation. Through 1877, we have an experiment with democracy in the South of Reconstruction. That essentially, in the end, fails. But between 1877 and then to 1920, remarkably, about 1 million African Americans farm, Black-owned farms. So actually more than 1 million, because you have more than that, more than one person per farm. And was an incredible accomplishment. But what happened over the next century is the sometimes gradual, sometimes fast decline of that autonomous farming. And we can't spend a long time talking about it, but a few things I think are worth emphasizing. First of all, at this moment that we just said, 1920, there were about 6 million farms in the United States. And as we just said, about 1 million of those were Black-run farms. Over that next century to today, the country's lost 2/3 of its farms. We've gone from 6 million to 2 million. That's been a tough road for all farmers. But what happened in particular with Black farmers is the numbers went from 1 million to, depending on how much you trust the census, let's just say 30, 40, maybe 50,000 people. If the decline in Black farms had been at the same rate as it was for white farms, in 2020, we would have 350,000 Black farms. And what that tells you is that the decline was nearly 10 times as stark, steep, and in its dispossession of people. So that is the monster hole that we dug as a society over the last century. I want to talk in particular just for a moment about the role the United States Department of Agriculture had in that decline. USDA, as people call it, is really quite an old department. It's supposed to be the people's department. It's a big bureaucracy, and it does a lot to help farmers succeed, not just in this year, but going back at least 70 or 80 years. It's been crucial for the success of farms. But the way USDA has been organized, though, is at a very local level, there are offices. And the USDA offices, in sort of an effort to be democratic, had county committees that organized and ran these offices that were elected. Well, that might work in, let's say, Iowa. I don't know for sure. But what we know is that in Alabama and Mississippi and Southwest Georgia, that meant that what was in theory democratic really meant white control of resources, white control top to bottom of those programs. And that was a decisive element in this rapid, massive decline of Black farming. This is exactly what Shirley's life's work has sought to confront. I want to just make a quick little note as well. Randy mentioned that there have been 2 large African-American discrimination lawsuits against USDA. We could talk a lot about those lawsuits. They moved about $2 billion to Black farmers and former Black farmers. But one of the things that I think doesn't really get noticed that comes out of these lawsuits, if you step back, is that for anybody who's suspicious that maybe there wasn't a lot of discrimination, let's think of it this way. In these 2 lawsuits, tens of thousands of people filed claims. They described to them what happened at the hands of USDA. And an independent, court-appointed neutral, after reviewing the facts, decided that roughly 30,000 people had been able to prove with substantial evidence that there was discrimination. So we can talk a lot about what the lawsuits did or didn't do, but one thing they did was create an incredibly powerful paper trail that describes people's lives and shows that an everyday person, a court-appointed neutral, will find that in 30,000 cases, there was discrimination based on race. That is our background. And Shirley, please tell us about your work.
Good evening, everyone. I'm always happy to share things that are happening here that happened and continue to happen in some cases in Southwest Georgia. When I was growing up on the farm, the last thing I wanted to do past high school was to have anything to ever do with agriculture after high school. I didn't want anyone to even talk to me about it because I grew up picking cotton and doing a lot of the other work. But of course, my father was murdered during my senior year of high school, and I made a commitment on the night of his death to stay in the South and work for change. Now, I didn't know, I was 17 years old. I didn't know what that would mean. I hadn't envisioned some of the situations I would find myself in. I knew it could be dangerous work at times, and it was. But I started that work with the civil rights movement, where we organized the movement with the help of a SNCC in our community, and ended up marrying the lead person from SNCC, and therefore that laid out the rest of my life's work, I guess you could say. Although I had committed to it, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And it was a strange time back then. People at Farmers Home Administration and the other agencies of USDA could just openly tell you that you're not going to get a program you were applying for. In the case of my father, he was having a home built. He really, really, really wanted a brick house because white farmers were getting houses made from brick. But the county supervisor told him a Black person could not get a loan to build a house from brick. You can either pick wood or you can pick blocks, but you cannot get a loan. You get the same loan now, but you couldn't get it to build a brick home. There were times when and I got, there would be dangerous situations, but I really enjoyed getting back at them. I have to say that. To give you an example, a farmer had received a letter saying he needed to come in for an appointment. He called me. This was around 87. So I told him I would meet him there. And I did. We walked into the office, and the guy, we sat down, and he started telling the farmer and his wife he was foreclosing on the farm and foreclosing on the home. And the wife started crying, and he just kept talking. But one of the things I had to do, and I can give the credit for it to Randy and the others and Stephen at Farmers Legal Action Group, I had to really learn the regulations better than the folks they had working in those offices. That was it was so key to having some success during the fight. But anyway, this guy's saying, he's just going on and on. The farmer's wife is just crying. She's getting louder. And I knew that what he was saying he would do, I knew he could not do it because there were some things he had to do before he could foreclose, and he had not done those. So he wouldn't stop talking. I finally stopped him and said, will you put that in writing? And this is when it got a little dangerous, because he pushed his chair back from the desk and started looking at the floor. He ended up turning the chair all the way around, looking at the floor, and then finally came back around to eye contact with me and said, I ain't putting nothing in writing. Boy, we went at it. And to this day, I wish I could remember what I said, but I couldn't. I was so into the fight. Anyway, I did notice that the farmer's wife had stopped crying. throughout all of this. And somehow we stopped. And he, as we were leaving, he told the farmer, you'll get the foreclosure letter. And it was less than 6 weeks, he said. And we left. But I can tell you that every time he sent something to the farmer, we appealed it. And we were appealing so much stuff. There were times I showed up for an appeal hearing when I didn't know, I'd have to ask, what are we here for today? But that farm is still in the family's hand. There were many other situations through the years, but the main thing for us was to get that training that was so key to our struggle that was provided by Farmers Legal Action Group.
So Shirley, I'm going to take a step back with you for just a second, because after the murder of George Floyd here in the Twin Cities, Al Sharpton gave a eulogy in which he said, George Floyd's story is a story of Black folks in America. I would submit in a way that because we know so little about the travails of Black farmers, but it's so deeply ingrained in the history of African Americans, your story is a reflection of the story of Black people in America. Can you tell us a little bit about your, background and how you did share some of that in terms of marrying Charles and your work with SNCC? But if you could talk about that, that'd be great, and just kind of share that history with us of your life and activism.
Yeah. So the farmer who murdered my father was never prosecuted because an all-white grand jury refused to indict him. So we had to, during that summer when we started the civil rights movement after my father's death, my father died in March, and we started the movement in June with the help of SNCC. As we were marching around the courthouse, that same man who murdered my father, there's a rock fence that goes around the courthouse. He would be sitting on the rock fence sometime with a gun in his lap. We had to try to let the fear go to fight what was happening to us. And we had a sheriff who ruled, there were big plantations in the county. Woodruff owned Itchaway Plantation with 33,000 acres. The Mellons, I think they're originally out of Pennsylvania, own to this day a 25,000 acre plantation. And there were the Nilo Plantation, if you turn that around, that's Olin spelled backwards, Olin. Those absentee landowners, I felt, allowed the sheriff to do the things he was doing, because he could just kill a Black person, nothing would happen. He had a speed trap set up where you couldn't come into the county without being stopped. And a lot of times you paid him on the road. The Atlanta paper estimated at one point that he was pocketing himself $150,000 a year. This was in the 50s and 60s, So living in those conditions and having to work on the farm was the reason why I wanted out. I thought that I would be able to live my life in the North. And even though we were landowners, I thought I could get my folks to leave, because things were so bad. When I look back, though, and I said this in a meeting I was in earlier today, because I was one who fought for integration of schools. It was about the worst thing that could happen to us, because we lost control of our children in that whole process. We had teachers and we had community. We had folks who really cared about whether we were successful or not, because they expected us to do good and reach back and help others in the county. So we didn't have much in terms of school supplies or a lab or even typewriters and all, but we had people who cared. And I remember they got rid of our typing class and said for PE, because this is a white superintendent and his wife was the visiting teacher and all. They didn't care about whether we were educated or not. So there were three of us who wanted to know how to type. So the typing teacher in his spare time would actually teach the three of us. But we had people who cared. And so in that atmosphere. My father is dead. I've committed to devoting my life to working for change, and each situation, each thing that we did in the movement led me to something else, If you're going to work, if you're going to organize in the rural areas, you have to work with farmers. So, fighting for change through in the civil rights movement led also, we were trying to get people, back then it was called the ASCS Committee, Agricultural Stabilization and Conservation Service. As people working in the civil rights movement, that was also one thing we were doing. We had lots of landowners, but had not been able to get a person elected to the committee. We eventually did that in 2 of the counties as part of our work in the movement. But once we would quietly wage a campaign so that they would understand what we were doing and get someone on, then they worked to get them out of there. So you could, it's like making 2 steps forward and 3 back, but you couldn't give up. You had to keep fighting and keep, doing that next thing and the next thing that could possibly help lead you to victory. Now, as a woman doing this work, I always tell this, the first co-op I organized was in Baker County, my home county. These were guys who had been working with my father, as farmers. And they didn't, I knew they just kind of tolerated me in the beginning. Because what can a woman tell you? I think that, and especially a young woman. So they wanted to start a feed a pig program because we were arranging to get some hogs through the Heifer Project. And one of the things was training, and you had to agree to accept training. And in the meetings, we know how to raise hogs. You don't need to tell us how to raise hogs. And I was just on them and on them. They wouldn't agree to the training, but the hogs came in. And we decided they would go to 3 farms initially, because you had to give 6 for 1. So the day after the hogs arrived, the guy from the Heifer Project came for a visit. He wanted to go to those farms. We went to the first one. Conditions were really bad. We went to the second one. Conditions were bad. And I almost told him as we were driving to the third one, because that farmer had bragged about having his hogs on concrete. I'm so glad the Lord kept my mouth closed, because they were worse. The project called me to the side and said, there's some major issues here. I said, let me tell you what they are. I wanted him to know that I knew. And it's awful, I won't even go into what they were, but they were bad. He was so proud of what he had, but what he had, he was not doing anything right. So anyway, I told the person from the Heifer Project to give me a chance now to set up the training. I called University of Georgia Extension. The guy wouldn't even talk to me. He told me to call Fort Valley State, which is the 1890 land grant institution. And they didn't actually have a person in the county. So, I had an uncle who was an extension agent during the years when Black extension agents could only work with Black farmers. I had uncles who were vocational ag teachers. So I said, okay. I said, y'all got to get me ready to start teaching these farmers about hogs, raising hogs. So I went into the next meeting and I started training them, when to clip eye teeth, when to castrate, about the feed, all of this stuff. And it was like, oh my goodness, you know how to raise hogs. I didn't have another problem.
Shirley, it's interesting to hear you talk about that, because we are literally in the midst of the year of the Black woman in a lot of ways. We look at Stacey Abrams and her work in engineering the delivery of Georgia to the Democratic Party. And yet you represent the long tradition of activism in the African-American community where women were front and center. In fact, I moderated a panel today with Gay Adams Massey from the YWCA here, who also carries on that tradition. I want to ask you specifically, though, and you did such a masterful job about talking about some of those problems that you faced. Here we are celebrating the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday. What was it like for you as a woman of color? You talked a lot about this already, but the unique challenges that you faced, not only during the civil rights movement, but in your contemporary walk, and having people challenge you both on the basis of being Black and being a woman.
Yes. Another question I get is, how can you stay positive? But that's what I had to do for myself. I couldn't let something like the first Black president firing me less than a year on the job when I had done nothing wrong. I could have allowed something like that to make me make a decision that it's just not worth it. But I know that you have to keep fighting. I could say to you, a year and a half after I married, 4 white men came into the house one Saturday morning when everybody else was out distributing the newsletter we had, and set the house on fire with me in it. I could have decided that it was too dangerous for me to continue to work, but you do what you have to do when you make a commitment. And when I make a commitment, I try to do everything I can to stand true to that. And there were times when I wouldn't let my husband be the one to talk because it was too dangerous for him to talk. It was easier for me to make the points. I remember one night we were coming from a mass meeting and about 5 police cars just surrounded our car to make us come to a stop. And even though my husband was driving, as the policeman was approaching the car, I would not let him respond to any question the policeman asked. I was the one who doing it. We tease about that now, but I knew that was potentially a very, very dangerous situation for him. It was dangerous our daughter was about right at 2 years old. It was dangerous for all 3 of us, but I felt I needed to step in. And I've done that so many times for farmers. That's why that farmer would want me to come to that meeting with him, because I could say things because I knew the answers, but I also could say things he couldn't say and still try to survive in the county where he worked. So I had this reputation back then. The Farm Service Agency workers in Southeast Georgia were saying she better not come over here with that mess. And of course, I had to do it a few times. I won't go into some of the stuff that happened. I felt bad for the woman afterwards, but I just became fearless in terms of standing up where our people couldn't stand up.
Love that. And I want to ask you, because we ultimately want to get to a conversation about how, what lessons we can learn for Black farmers that could be helpful in Minnesota. But before we get there, I have to ask you about your work with the Federation of Southern Cooperatives and what specific problems you saw that Black farmers faced.
Oh, gosh. Well, one of the things I realized early on, our farmers could go to church and maybe stand behind a truck and talk a little bit, but one wasn't willing to share, let's say, what he did to get a very successful peanut crop, for example. They kept it all to themselves. And I realized early on, I needed to get them together and get them talking. That's how the co-ops that were organized just from getting people to come together to discuss working together. So that, getting that to happen early on, our farmers didn't do a lot of planning in terms of business plans. So, and keeping records. So working with them on record keeping and business planning and getting them to look at working together to purchase supplies or to sell together. We have an auction market here in Thomasville, Georgia, about 60 miles away. And during the 80s and 90s, it's an auction market. So the buyers would come together and make sure a Black farmer got very little if he could sell his product on the state farmers market. Sometimes they would get a white farmer to take their product through, so they knew the kind of prices some of them were getting. So what do we have to do? We organized farmers into a cooperative, South Georgia Vegetable Co-op. We got them to put their few little pennies together to try to, and we located a market out of Atlanta, but you got to get it from Atlanta, from South Georgia near the Florida line to Atlanta, 200 miles away. 5 of them had to go to the bank to sign to get a note to get a $7,500 truck that broke down most of the time. When they tried we got one of the farmers with a stall at the farmers market that had refrigeration. When the farmers would bring the product there so that it could be shipped from there into Atlanta, the buyers on the farmers on the market complained, and they all said to the buyer, they were refusing to sell to the buyers who were there if they continued to buy from Black farmers. So it forced us to go out into an old school out in the rural area. Then we developed, because of the relationships in the Federation and getting connected with other organizations, we connected with Red Tomato in Boston, Massachusetts, and worked out a deal to sell seedless watermelons in Boston. We could get more, we could make more, we couldn't even sell our watermelons locally. So we were shipping seedless melons from Boston, Georgia to Boston, Massachusetts, and made that work for about 5 years until we had drought and farmers didn't have irrigation. So, we had to end up losing a market like that. And I could go from one to the other, where lack of the ability to get resources out of USDA that all white farmers were getting hindered the progress farmers were making with the things they were growing.
Thank you, Shirley. And Stephen put a great resource in the chat for folks to follow up on this. Shirley, I feel like we are so lucky to have you this evening, particularly in this moment. I have another question for you, then I'd like to bring it back for both of you, but you were involved in new communities. Could you describe the problems you faced with your work with new communities?
Yes. So as we were working in the civil rights movement in the area, people who were living on farm or land owned by white people would get kicked out of those homes if they had their kids, if they were trying to get their children to integrate the schools or to exercise their right to vote and so forth. So we decided we would try to build a community. There was some funding available through the Office of Economic Opportunity, OEO. So during the summer of 1968, 7 people, my husband was one of them, went to Israel to look at how they were resettling their people and came back with that report. We started working at that point, and that was July was when the first meeting was held after their return. We decided that we would move forward with trying to build a community. We got our hands on 6,000 acres of land. We were able to get a 1-year option on it as we were planning the community. We had been assured, OEO gave us a planning grant and had been assured they would make a major investment in it once the plans were complete. Now, it was during the Nixon administration, we had to hire someone out of DC who was friendly to the Nixon administration, but we got our plan. But so much opposition by that point. White people were shooting at some of our buildings with us in them. They were organizing politically to get us off that land. They did everything they could so that OEO in the end felt politically they could not give us the direct grant they had promised. And actually, Lester Maddox was the governor of the state. He vetoed all funding coming into the state for our project. So we were left then to just give up the effort or to continue to try to hold on. Those of us locally decided we had never had our hands on that much land, and there was no way we were walking away. So we started farming, and that's when we experienced all of this discrimination out of USDA. They would not give us any loans through Farmers Home Administration. We were able to pull together the resources to get equipment and to begin farming. And we would discover once corn was, was maturing, that as it was coming up, it wasn't coming up even like it would if the fertilizer we purchased was the actual fertilizer we were purchasing. We were using liquid fertilizer, and corn would be tall and short all over the field, and you knew that it was the liquid fertilizer. But because of the discrimination at Extension, they knew what was going on, but they wouldn't help certify it. So it forced us to actually pull samples from every delivery. And there are many other things that would happen. You take peanuts in and to sell them, and then you get a grade that's a low grade when you know you had a quality crop. They did everything they could to get us off the land. It wasn't working until we ended up with a drought, and followed by another year of drought. So we went to Farmers Home Administration for an emergency loan that we later learned the plantations in the area were getting. These rich guys were getting the loans that we were being denied. But the county supervisor said to us, you'll get a loan here over my dead body, which put us into a 3-year fight just to try to get an emergency loan, which is too long if you're farming 2,000 acres. And then you couldn't get the amount that was needed, and never would finance irrigation for us. So I could go on and on about, and these are all things that were being done, not just to us, but to other Black farmers across the South to assure, so that they could make sure they would actually lose the land. And then they'd have, in our case, our assets were worth almost $5 million. A rich guy out of Atlanta bought it for $1 million, and then the agency let him borrow $950,000 of that.
Shirley, I mean, the stories are incredible. I feel like we could talk about that all night, but given that it is Martin Luther King's birthday week, mm-hmm. and we had a remarkable year last year. We lost C.T. Vivian, we lost Congressman John Lewis, and we are fortunate to have griots who are able to share so much from that period. Mm-hmm. You were involved in the campaign that Dr. King talked about as being one of his greatest defeats, going up against Sheriff Lori Pritchett in Albany, Georgia. Do you mind sharing your reflections of the Albany movement with us?
Yes, and let me say that Albany got a bad rap from historians. They say that our movement was a failure. And Dr. King's statement was that he failed in Albany. He didn't say when he came here, the movement was going on. He came into a movement that was, filling the jails and so forth. And he left to move on, but the movement didn't end. In fact, I can say to you that the Southwest Georgia Project, my husband was he was one of the founding members and first field secretary of SNCC. His work was known as the Southwest Georgia Project. So when Stokely said white people needed to leave SNCC and go work in their own communities, we didn't agree. My husband had graduated from Union Theological Seminary in New York with his master's and recruited heavily from Union. So we had a lot of white people working with us. So at that point, this was 1966, we separated from SNCC and incorporated the Southwest Georgia Project for Community Education. It's the only area where someone from SNCC came in and didn't leave, and the work has continued from 1961, and here we are at 2021. We're hoping to celebrate 60 years of the Southwest Georgia movement this year. But Dr. King came into a movement. My husband talks all the time about how it would, he's beating the bushes, they're canvassing, but when Dr. King came to town, you had two churches that were facing each other on a corner. Both churches would be full, so it made the recruitment easier. And we looked upon him as a leader. I hate that he ever said he failed in Albany, because they got it wrong, the historians, and they're beginning to come back around now and look at what we've been able to do, and the fact that we didn't get a lot of resources to do what we did, but we've had a lot of people who, both rural and those here in the Albany area, who were hungry for the ability to do something about the situations they live in. And that I can go back to this most recent election and share with you what we did. We love Stacey for what she's done. We love LaTosha Brown, but they were all ignoring the rural area. And because I've worked in the rural area all of this time, I had to keep saying, we got to find resources to help get the rural vote out. And that Steve Kornacki kept pointing to Southwest Georgia when he was giving the statistics and so forth. They never expected the voting to be at the level it was at in Southwest Georgia. But it's because we had an organized effort here in the rural area.
I love what you shared, Shirley, because we do spend a lot of time focusing on charismatic leadership, and we want to celebrate Dr. King, but you're right. Your life and your life's work is a blueprint for how ordinary people, as John Lewis termed it, actually were the backbone of the movement, local people who built longitudinal movements. And your work is certainly a testament to that, testimony to that. I want to ask you and Stephen now, are there lessons to be learned from your work with Black farmers that could be helpful in Minnesota? And we'll start with Stephen to give you a short break, Shirley, and then I'll let you wrap up.
I think that when the challenges are so great, it's easy to feel like very little can be done. And I think that the Black farmer struggles and the resurgence of Black farming now tells us that struggle works, and that self-help organization works, and that agitation works, and that you can experiment with alternatives. And so, I mean, one of the things that Shirley, you might describe a little bit is Cypress Farms and sort of what's happened with new communities over the long term, because it's, we talk about the negatives, and there's plenty to talk about, but there were victories and there were successes, and nobody faced odds a lot longer than yours and in your work, and you have been a success. And I think that's what's inspiring, and we can learn a lot from that work that you've done.
So one of the things I've said to farmers through the years, when my father was farming, those guys back in the 60s could work the land that they had and try to do the best that they could on their land. But one of the things I've said to farmers through the years is you have to work together. Whether you call it a cooperative or an association, or whatever name you want to call it, you can't work that little 100 acres or 50 acres these days and just be to yourself. You need each other. So working together is the key to some of the successes that we have. And then trying to, we're not one to think much about working on policy, but it's necessary. So connecting with other groups. It was so necessary for the Federation to work with groups out of the Midwest and the Northeast and so forth. As we worked, we wanted a Black Farmers' Rights Act. It was eventually introduced, but not as a Black Farmers' Rights Act. Mike Espy was the congressman from Mississippi who introduced it in the House, and White Fowler was the senator from Georgia who introduced it in the Senate. And they told us at the last minute, no one's going to vote for anything just for Black farmers. So it had to be called the Minority Farmers' Rights Act to include all minorities. In later years, they even added women. They've added veterans. They've added every kind of category, but it was based on the fact that Black farmers were being discriminated against and losing land at an alarming rate and needed something special to work on that. But that legislation would never have come forth if we had not worked together and networked with not just Black groups, but white groups out of the Midwest and others. So, when people come together and have discussions, it leads to action. So, farmers got to realize they need each other. Now, if you're not one of those big corporate farms, you need each other to try to survive.
We're getting a heck of a history and civics lesson today, and also thanks to your insight, Shirley, some profound insight on how African-American civil rights have always pushed the boundaries of American democracy. And that's a clear example there, perhaps no clearer of an example. We have a couple questions from the audience that I'm going to take. I'm actually going to try to take all of them if I can. The first one is directed to you, Shirley, and it's the new administration. What are your hopes for Black farmers in the next 4 years?
Well, there is no doubt that that agency that could do so much to help Black farmers, family farmers, is still looking to corporate farms and the big guys. They get the bulk of everything. As I said to Vilsack recently when he was nominated, I'm not opposing his nomination, although the things that, groups were putting out there, all of these reasons why he shouldn't be the secretary. And the first thing on the list was what he did to Shirley Sherrod. Well, sure, there was an apology years ago, but I'm one who can't dwell on that stuff. I have to try to move on. I have to try to see, okay, in this situation, what can we get out of it? What I said to him is, you don't have to learn the agency. You know it. There should be no excuse this time around for you making some major changes for Black farmers, family farmers, small farmers, so I'm expecting a lot, but I'm also prepared to fight, just because you get someone in there. I can't think that a Biden-Harris is going to turn the world around. Somehow people get in and they forgot who put them there and go on and continue to do the things they do. And we've had to deal with that through the years. So you can't stop fighting, but I am expecting some major change out of this administration.
Thank you, Shirley. And Colleen Bell, thank you for your comment. Amen to that. We have a question for Stephen. Stephen, Danya's wondering if you could name Black Minnesota farmers whose work we should be following, both as farmers and agricultural policy leaders.
So I think the main activity in Minnesota for Black farmers is in urban areas. And so we have, for example, in St. Paul, Frogtown Farm, and there are other independent people, quite a number of them. If you email me, I can put you in contact with people. And I'll put my email on the chat. But what you have in Minnesota are a lot of people trying to reclaim urban spaces for food production and things like that. And so I just noticed that somebody just posted a very good example is the Urban Farm and Garden Alliance, which is very active for a long time. So people face barriers, as they always do, in trying to reclaim land and reclaim the food system. And urban is just a different variety. So it's an uphill struggle, but we have people doing really, really good work. And so I would totally agree with the comment here that the Urban Farm and Garden Alliance is a great place to start. I should name other people, but it's, you know, if you email me, we can get you more names.
Thank you so much, Stephen. We are unfortunately out of time for this part of our program. I want to say again, I think we're so blessed this evening to be joined by Stephen and Shirley. Shirley in particular, I just want to say to you, especially this week in the shadow of everything that we've experienced since January 6th, thank you for your service. I think you embody the very essence of the mission of Interfaith St. Paul. And I also know that faith has been a big part of your work. So Thank you for everything. We owe a tremendous debt to you and to your work. And with that, I'll pass it back to Randy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Uhuru. Thank you for doing a wonderful job asking questions and letting the story unfold. Thank you, Stephen, for giving us context. And Shirley, thank you so much for zooming all the way up to Minnesota to be with us. I know you'd love this community if you were here. And I have to tell you, we're trying to cook up a plan where this is just the beginning.
Good.
So we will be in touch a lot more, but thank you. And thank you for letting our community here learn from you and feel your stories. Thank you.
Thank you.